But a lot of this permissiveness is people are just basically afraid. They're afraid of any kind of confrontation.
Yeah.
They're afraid of any kind of conflict. And through conflict and confrontation is how you actually grow. It's actually how you develop as a person, you
Hey,
know?
so here's a cool stat. This is really interesting, man. So
Yeah.
there's been some great work on what behavioral markers predict divorce in couples counseling. Really
Yeah.
solid work. Okay, so here's one predictor. If when the couple is talking in front of a therapist and one of them or the other or both roll their eyes, there's like a 95% chance they're going to be divorced within 6 months. And that's contempt. They've become so disconnected because they don't communicate, because the resentment has built up that they now have contempt for each other. But here's another cool fact from that research. So if you have people track the number of positive and negative interactions with their partner, you can calculate ratios, and then you can see what the ratio is that lends itself to the successful maintenance of a relationship. And so you might think, well, the more positive interactions, the better. And that's kind of true. So if it falls below 5 positive to 1 negative, the relationship is in danger. But if it rises, 5 to 1. And you can kind of see that because, negative events are more memorable and more powerful than positive ones. And so you know that if you read YouTube comments,
Yeah.
But if it rises above 11 to 1, the relationship is also in danger. And you could imagine that what you want in a relationship is, well, you want support and love, and you want most of your interactions to be positive, but you want your partner to slap you now and then when you're being stupid.
Right.
And then if they don't, out comes your inner tyrant, right? You're just going to dominate them if they don't push back. And so if you have any sense too, if you have a partner, you want to encourage them to put limits on you, especially if they're a little more timid than you temperamentally. It's like you don't want to run roughshod over them because they know some things you don't. But it's so cool that it's above 11 to 1. So that means too much positivity is the death knell for a relationship. And you want someone with some spark, right? It's like, well, what if I push you a little bit? Even teasing. Yeah. You want the person to be able to push back a bit.
And you have to be able to accept it as well, because some people probably in those situations can't stand any kind of criticism. They're so fragile that if the other person pushes back, it kind of escalates into a battle. So real strength comes from the ability in a relationship or any kind of intimate or otherwise, is the ability to take that kind of criticism, to actually welcome it when people set limits for you and tell you that this kind of behavior is wrong. And then you can evaluate and assess yourself.
Yeah, unless you want to repeat it stupidly forever, right? I mean, that's the alternative in a relationship. Is I don't like conflict. I've been in plenty of conflicts, like plenty, way more than is reasonable. But I don't like them. Like
few people do.
I meet people now and then. I went to talk to Douglas Murray in New York City about a week ago, and we were talking about conflict. And he said, he doesn't mind a fight. And I've met lots of people like that they like that combativeness. And I don't really. But what I really hate is deferred conflict that escalates. It's like, it's better to get it over with now. And you're a fool if you think that running away from it is going to, like if someone cuts you off in traffic and they're obviously really angry, it's probably better just to get the hell out of there because you're never going to see that person again, and you don't want a situation like that to escalate because
they might have a gun or whatever.
Well, yeah, you just don't know what's up with them. They're really strangers.
Yeah.
But, if you're dealing with someone day in and day out and they're pushing on the top of your head to stop you from growing, which I think Lucy used to do to Linus in the Peanuts cartoons. Yeah, because they had a dark side, those cartoons, man. The comics, they sure did. Yeah.
Oh, they would be canceled now, probably.
Yeah, they couldn't exist now, I don't think. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, because a lot of Schultz's characters, Lucy was actually not a likable character at all.
Right,
and she was really oppressive to Linus, who was a good character. Yeah. And good humor always has an edge. But that you don't get rid of the negative part of yourself, especially that aggressive part, by pretending it doesn't exist. That quite the contrary. That just doesn't work at all.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry, you were going to say something?
I was just going to ask you about your new,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about working with 50 Cent and the rappers, and I
Okay.
wanted to ask you about your new book too. So let's start with, so how did this partnership with 50 Cent come about?
Well, the book was very popular with rappers, as I said, because of the nature of the music industry. And he reached out to me. He wanted to meet me because the 48 Laws of Power was sort of his Bible, as he expressed it. So I met him in New York, kind of in the back room of this steakhouse. It was sort of like something straight out of The Godfather. I was kind of the one white guy amongst his whole group there. I was a little bit intimidated, to be honest. I didn't know what to expect because he has this reputation. Ended up, he was really nice and really interesting, actually a very kind of sweet guy, not what you expect. And I just finished writing my book on warfare and strategy, which is kind of my version of Sun Tzu's Art of War, how to strategize in conflicts, sort of like what you're talking about. And he has a very strategic mind, and we kind of had a really nice connection. And I thought, so much in our culture is creating these stupid kind of divisions and walls. Like you're in academia, you only write academic books. You're a popular person, you only write popular books. You come from this community, you come from that community, and you never communicate. And I thought it would be very interesting to write a book coming from two opposite backgrounds. Me, middle-class Jewish boy from Los Angeles, and him from Southside Queens. Something interesting could happen from a collaboration. There's not enough of that in our culture, I believe, because even though our circumstances were very different, our minds were very similar. We were thinking on a similar plane that kind of transcended these sort of superficial differences. So I spent time with him, and I was trying to figure out what is the essence of his power, what makes him such a compelling figure and made him not one of those people in Southside Queens who ended up kind of spiraling downward, ending up in prison. What saved him? And I determined that the quality he had was this kind of fearlessness. And it isn't the kind of fearlessness where you go beating people up or something. It's kind of an inner strength. He had been shot when he was like 20 years old, like 9 bullets right there through a car window, one of the bullets lodged in his mouth. And he survived miraculously. And it gave him this kind of calmness, like, I have nothing to fear. I almost died. Bring it on. I don't really care. And so I observed him in meetings. I observed that kind of calmness and how he could take over a meeting, not by being super aggressive, but just by having this kind of dominant persona. And I thought that there's tremendous power in this fearlessness, not being afraid to be different, not being afraid to have conflict and confrontation, not being afraid of death itself, not being afraid of the reality of your situation, on and on. So the book that we formed together was kind of a meditation on 10 forms of fearlessness. And I found, I thought that I was a relatively fearless person, which in some ways I am. I seem agreeable, but I'm actually in some ways a little bit bold and adventurous. But compared to him, I realized, no, I'm actually riddled with fears. And just being around him and kind of writing the book helped me a lot in my, kind of overcome some of my own limits and some of my own fears. So that's where that book came
it's
out.
nice to have a model like that really close by, right? To contrast yourself with. Yeah, and you can learn a lot from. So do you think that fearlessness that you saw in him, you think part of that was a consequence of that brush with death? How much of that do you think was temperamental too in him?
Well, there's a kind of a reckless fearlessness that a lot of people from the hood have, which doesn't really serve them very well, and it gets them in a lot of trouble, right? He has a very kind of strategic, under control fearlessness.
Hey, I got something cool to tell you about that. So
what?
I was talking to David Buss. Yes, I believe it. And he's an evolutionary psychologist, a good one. And we were talking about this Machiavellian personality triad, the dark triad that Del Paulos, UBC. Yeah, okay. So here's something really interesting. It's the bad boy paradox, they call it, that young, naive women are attracted to those Machiavellian types. Definitely. But when they get older and more experienced, they start to be able to see through that. The reason they're attracted to it, as far as I can tell, and I talked about this with Bus to see if I was way off on the wrong track, is that those reckless, fearless people mimic real fearless competence. And young women aren't good at distinguishing between the two. And so they get sucked in by the sort of psychopathic recklessness because they think it's fearless competence. And then, of course, the guys who are doing that, they'll prey on that because they're trying to ape competence. But what the women are really after in their heart of hearts, they might be out for an adventure too, because there's that element of it. But they want that fearlessness that does go along with true generosity and competence, and also the ability to keep, real darkness away.